Without a penny in his pocket, a poor young man got into a taxi begging for help. What the driver did after hearing his story left everyone in tears. The city was completely engulfed in darkness. The rain poured heavily, as if the sky were overflowing with its own emotions. The traffic lights and car headlights barely managed to cut through the curtain of water that fell upon the streets. Every puddle reflected a city that was alive, yet impersonal, indifferent to the people slipping through it. Thomas walked slowly down the sidewalk, his shoes already soaked, his pants clinging to his legs from the dampness. His backpack, although old and worn, was all he had. Inside, it held his last remaining hope, a crumpled letter from a grandfather he never knew. Water gathered in the corners of his eyes, not just from the rain, but also from the unshed tears of a life marked by loneliness and abandonment. The letter, yellowed with time, was his only link to the past, the only thread connecting him to something beyond the emptiness in which he found himself. Thomas had grown up in foster homes, moving from house to house, never feeling like he belonged anywhere. He had lived surrounded by strangers, watching as other happy families gave him what he had never had: love and stability. And although he always tried his best, something inside him never ceased to feel that constant absence, that lack of a real home. The letter, which came to him by pure chance, arrived at his shelter one ordinary night. A stranger showed up, handing him the envelope with his name written in shaky handwriting. It claimed to be from his grandfather, someone who had passed away before he could meet him, but had left him a promise, an inheritance that could change his life. The letter spoke of a small, distant village, a place Thomas had never heard of. It was his last chance. That piece of paper was all he had left. But at that moment, he didn't have a penny to get to the village. And hunger, that constant feeling of emptiness in his stomach, reminded him of how little he had left. With no money, with nothing, Thomas walked the streets like a lost shadow in the darkness. The sound of water hitting the wet asphalt was his only companion. Each step echoed in the emptiness, as if the city itself were rejecting him. The loneliness surrounded him, deeper than the night itself. He thought about the village, about what it could be. Would it really be a place where he could find what he had always sought? A family, a purpose. He stopped under a bridge, seeking some shelter from the downpour. His fingers, numb from the cold, gripped the letter tightly, as if holding it could anchor him to the only promise he had left. He looked around, and in that moment, something caught his attention. A taxi, parked by the roadside, the lights off, the engine silent. And inside, a man, looking as lonely as he was, lying back in his seat, hands folded over his stomach. Thomas hesitated. He had learned to distrust strangers, to expect nothing from anyone. Throughout his life, he had witnessed many lies, broken promises, and failed hopes. But something at that moment made him approach. Maybe it was the need, or the desperation, or perhaps the idea that, like him, this man too must be a solitary soul, searching for answers in a world that seemed to have none. With hesitant steps, he approached the taxi. The man inside didn't notice him coming. Thomas stopped by the window, unsure whether to knock or simply walk away. His hand trembled as it reached for the glass. The rain drenched his face, but the cold felt nothing compared to what he felt inside. Thomas softly tapped on the window, and instantly the glass lowered a few inches. The taxi driver, in his 50s, looked at him with a gaze that pierced through him like a spear. He was tired, worn out. His face showed the marks of years of work, the traces of a difficult life, but also the indifference learned from years of witnessing others suffering without being able to do anything about it. "What do you want?" the driver asked, his voice deep and raspy. Thomas swallowed. His voice cracked as he spoke, but he managed to say it. "I need to get to a village. I have no money, but please, I need to get there. I just want a chance. My grandfather left me a letter. He said there's an inheritance for me. I have no other choice." The driver looked at him silently, not moving, as the wind and rain raged outside. Thomas expected rejection, the denial, the sorry he had heard so many times before. But, for some reason, this time he couldn't pull away. Fear paralyzed him, but so did the need to be heard. After a few seconds that seemed eternal, the driver lowered his gaze, as if making a difficult decision. The sound of the taxi's engine broke the silence, and the doors unlocked. "Get in," he said, without saying another word. Thomas, surprised, climbed into the taxi without speaking. The car started, leaving behind the city lights that faded as they headed toward the horizon. Thomas didn't know what to expect, nor what would happen next. He only knew that, for the first time in his life, someone had given him a chance. The journey had begun, and with it, a new hope. Michael, like the city, seemed trapped in an endless routine. He had spent over 30 years behind the wheel of his taxi, driving the same streets, taking strangers to their destinations, but never allowing anyone to truly know him. Each day was a repeat of the last, a cycle of miles and passengers, without surprises, without emotions. The taxi was his refuge, his safe place, his life reduced to a seat, a steering wheel, and a gaze fixed on the horizon. The death of his son, Diego, years ago, had left a deep scar, a wound that never healed. After that tragedy, Michael became even more solitary, almost reclusive. He helped others when necessary, but always from a safe distance, as if fearing that any attempt to get close to someone else might reopen old wounds. He had learned not to expect anything from others, not even gratitude. Living in that emotional bubble kept him safe, kept him in control. As Michael drove, his mind wandered. It had been so long since he had really talked to anyone. Thomas, the young man he had picked up that night, reminded him of a past he tried to leave behind. His face, soaked by the rain, showed a mix of hopelessness and need, something Michael recognized all too well. He didn't dare ask him more about his life, and neither did the young man. There was something in that empty gaze that told Michael Thomas wasn't looking for compassion, just a bit of hope. Something Michael had lost long ago. The rain hammered against the windshield, but the silence inside the taxi was even louder. Michael didn't know how to start a conversation. He didn't know what to say. It was the first time he had picked up someone with such a desolate story. He had driven thousands of people over the years, but few times had he felt that something more was at stake. Something told him that this encounter wasn't a coincidence, that somehow they were both on the same journey, even if they didn't know it yet. In an attempt to break the silence, Michael decided to speak, although his words were short, laden with the emotional reserve he had built over the years. "What brings you here?" he asked without looking at him, keeping his attention on the road, as if trying to avoid Thomas's gaze. Thomas took a moment to respond, as if the words were forming in his mind, but not knowing how to put them together. Finally, his broken voice shattered the silence. "A village. I don't know much, just that there's something there. Something my grandfather left for me." Thomas gripped the letter tightly, as though afraid it might disintegrate between his fingers. Michael glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. "Your grandfather?" Michael asked, still not looking at the young man, but noticing the nostalgia in his words. "I never knew him. The letter came from a man who said he was his friend." Thomas paused, as though trying to find the right words. "It says he left something for me, an inheritance. But I don't know what it is. I just know I have to get there." Michael felt a sharp pang in his heart, as if Thomas's words were connecting him to something from his own past. The pain of loss, the uncertainty of not knowing what lay ahead, the feeling that life no longer offered pleasant surprises. He had lived with that weight for years. "The village is small, quiet." Michael finally spoke, breaking the silence again, this time with a softer tone. "There's not much there. If you're looking for something more, you might not find it." Thomas nodded without saying anything. He knew Michael was trying to warn him, but his hope was still stronger than any caution. Throughout his life, he had learned to endure disappointment, but now, for the first time, he felt he could cling to something else. The letter was his last chance, the last trace of a future that could be different. Despite the storm in his heart, he felt that something bigger was at stake, something he couldn't yet understand, but that drove him to move forward. The taxi kept moving, cutting through the darkness of the empty road. Meanwhile, Michael kept driving, not asking any more questions. He didn't want to get too involved. For years, he had kept an emotional distance from others, but something in the young man was disarming him, something he couldn't ignore. And then, without warning, without expecting an answer, Michael spoke again. "You know, I lost something too, a long time ago. My son, Diego." Michael's voice trembled for a moment, but he remained firm. "He was a good kid, and when he left, I was left empty. The job, the taxi, all this. It's the only thing that keeps me busy. I don't mind not being a part of anyone's life, but if I can help someone, I will." Thomas looked at him in the rearview mirror, noticing the vulnerability in his voice, something he hadn't expected from such a reserved man. He didn't say anything, but his heart beat faster. For a moment, he felt Michael's story resonating with his own, as if they were connected by something invisible, something neither of them fully understood. "Thank you for helping me," Thomas murmured, almost whispering, as if the words were too big to leave his mouth. Michael didn't respond. The journey continued, but now, in that small space inside the taxi, there was something more than the engine and the rain. There was an unspoken understanding, a bond slowly forming between them, without the need for words. Something in the air was changing, and unknowingly, both were heading toward a destination that, though uncertain, would offer them a chance to heal and perhaps rediscover what it truly meant to live. The journey continued, but the silence inside the taxi was no longer the same. Though the rain still fell with the same intensity, something had changed between Thomas and Michael. The atmosphere that had been filled with distrust and reservation at first now carried an inexplicable tension, a silent connection neither of them fully understood, but which, in some way, brought them together. It was as if fate, without warning, had started writing their story at that very moment. Thomas settled back in his seat, taking off his backpack and leaving it aside. Through the foggy window, he watched as the city slowly faded from the rearview mirror. He knew this was the last stretch of his life in the city, the last breath of the life he had known. The village, his last hope, lay beyond the hills, beyond the winding roads that began to take them away from the noise and chaos of urban life. And although uncertainty still accompanied him, Thomas felt that, at least this time, he was stepping toward something new, something different. Michael, for his part, kept his eyes on the road, without stopping. The windshield wipers slid in a constant rhythm, moving across the glass with the same mechanical motion as his daily life. From time to time, his gaze shifted to the rearview mirror, where he saw Thomas's face, now calmer, but still marked by a silent sadness. The young man had said little after their brief conversation about his grandfather, but Michael noticed he seemed thoughtful, almost as if lost in his own mind, searching for meaning in something he didn't fully understand. What is it he hopes to find in that village? Michael thought. What kind of inheritance could change someone's life like his? But he didn't say anything. His experience told him that no one could really find what they were looking for in those small, remote villages. What people sought generally couldn't be found, or at least not in the way they imagined. He knew that from his own pain. But still, something urged him to keep driving. Something told him he had to let the young man reach his destination, even if only to discover it for himself. The hum of the engine was the only sound. The empty road stretched before them, with distant lights flickering like lost signals. After a while, the sound of the rain filled the void between them, until Thomas broke the silence. "Have you ever thought about leaving all this?" he asked timidly, not taking his eyes off the window. Michael was surprised. He hadn't expected Thomas to speak, much less about something so deep. "Leave the taxi," Michael replied with a slight ironic smile that appeared unintentionally. "Yes, sometimes. I've thought about retiring, but I don't know what I'd do. Maybe I don't have anything to go back to, or maybe I'm afraid of being alone at home." He paused, and Thomas noticed the sadness seeping into his words. "This taxi is my life, my companion. It keeps me busy." Thomas didn't know what to say. There was something in the way Michael spoke that reminded him of his own life, that feeling of being trapped in a routine that consumes you, that stops you from looking forward to something different. Thomas knew what it was like to feel trapped. He had felt it his whole life. The feeling of not belonging, of not fitting anywhere. But now, with that letter in hand, something inside him was beginning to change. Something inside him pushed him to take this final step, without really knowing what lay at the end of the road. "I understand," Thomas murmured after a moment. "Sometimes I feel like all I want is to find something that tells me it's worth going on." Michael didn't respond, but his mind began to wander. That conversation had made him think about his son, Diego. Was this the same emptiness that Diego had felt before he died? The same search for something to give meaning to his life? He couldn't help but think that maybe Thomas was right. Maybe they were both looking for the same thing, even though they didn't know it yet. The road seemed endless, and the taxi's lights, like ghosts, disappeared into the mist that surrounded everything. A few lonely street lamps briefly lit the way as the wind shook the vehicle, as if trying to open a window to something beyond the darkness. As they drove on, Michael began to remember the days when he used to travel with Diego. When his son was little, he would always ride along in the taxi with him. He loved to tell stories about faraway places, inventing worlds where people could fly or travel through time. How many dreams had he shared with him? How many times had they laughed while he drove, talking about impossible futures? For some reason, those memories seemed to drift further away each day. Diego's death had exiled him to a distant place, where memories blurred and the pain, deep and unrelenting, left no room for anything else. But seeing Thomas there, with his backpack and lost eyes, brought him a kind of reflection he hadn't had in years. What would have happened if he had taken another path? If he had fought for more, for not letting himself be consumed by his own sorrow? Finally, the rain began to ease, and the sky, which had been so dark, started to clear slowly. Thomas looked out the window and saw the first lights of dawn begin to appear on the horizon. Though he wasn't sure what he would find, something inside him told him that this journey, however strange it was leading him to a place where, maybe, just maybe, he could find answers. The road now seemed calmer, and Michael slowed the taxi down. In his mind, he felt a mix of uncertainty and a strange hope he couldn't explain. He glanced at Thomas, who now seemed more relaxed, almost as if, like him, he was letting go of the weight of what was behind. "You know," Michael said, breaking the silence, "maybe I need to find something on this journey too." Thomas looked at him for a moment, saying nothing, but a small smile appeared on his face. He didn't understand what Michael meant, but something in his tone made him think that maybe it wasn't just him who needed a change. Maybe, in some way, everyone needed to find something, a place, or a reason that helped them move forward. The taxi continued along the peaceful road, heading toward the unknown village where Thomas would find his inheritance and where Michael might find something far deeper than a simple chance to escape his pain. The road stretched out ahead of them, fading into the horizon like an endless path. The rain had stopped completely, but the sky was still covered by a grey layer, giving the landscape a sense of stillness, of waiting. The silence in the taxi was comfortable, quieter than in previous chapters, as if the conversation between Thomas and Michael had begun to open a door neither of them knew how to cross until that moment. Thomas, who had kept a low profile until now, guarding his thoughts as if they were a treasure to be discovered, looked at the letter in his hands with a mixture of fear and hope. The envelope was wrinkled, the ink starting to fade in some places, but his grandfather's name was still legible. James. That word was all he had, the golden thread connecting him to something beyond his sad reality. He had spent his whole life not knowing who that man was, but now, with the letter in his hands, he felt that he might begin to understand a little more about himself. Michael watched him out of the corner of his eye while driving, sensing there was something more in that letter than Thomas was willing to share. He didn't say anything, but there was a curiosity in his look that he couldn't hide. What did Thomas expect to find in that village? What had his grandfather left him? For some reason, Michael felt that this young man, whom he barely knew, was about to discover something that would change his life forever. Something that, somehow, could also change his own. "What does the letter say?" Michael finally asked, not turning his head toward Thomas, but with a soft tone that suggested more interest than he had shown until then. Thomas looked up, surprised by the question, but then, as if he had been waiting for this moment, he started to speak, his voice slightly wavering, as if he wasn't sure how to put into words what he felt. "It's from my grandfather." Thomas looked at the letter, not fully opening it, as if he struggled to let go of that moment. "He tells me that he lived here, in this village. He never knew me, but he always thought about me. The letter says that when he died, he left something for me. Something that, according to him, would change my life." Michael raised his eyebrows, but didn't say anything. Thomas's tone, the way he spoke of his grandfather as if he were a distant but essential figure, touched a chord in him. There was something familiar in that feeling of searching for something beyond the present, something that told you your life had a purpose. And although Michael didn't want to admit it, he felt that he too had been searching for something for years. "And what do you think it is?" Michael asked, this time more concerned with the answer than the question itself. Thomas remained silent for a moment, the letter squeezed tightly between his hands. He seemed thoughtful, as if the words didn't want to come out, but finally he answered, his voice quieter now, almost as if speaking to himself. "I don't know. I have no idea," he said sincerely. "I just know I have nothing. And if this is my only chance, I have to take it. I have to go, even though I don't know what I'll find there." Michael briefly glanced at him in the rearview mirror. Thomas didn't seem to be searching for fortune or material wealth. His tone, the way he spoke about the matter, was almost as if he was seeking something intangible, answers, identity, maybe peace. Something that, much as Michael wanted to ignore it, he too felt was missing in his life. The conversation hung in the air while the taxi kept moving forward. Thomas placed the letter on the seat and looked out the window, his thoughts wrapped in the stillness of the empty road. There was so much he didn't know, so much he didn't understand about what lay ahead. But something inside him told him this journey had a purpose, that somehow he would find what he had been searching for his entire life. Time seemed to stop for a while as they both sank into their own thoughts. Thomas felt a strange mix of hope and fear. What could he expect to find in that village? Could it be possible that his grandfather, a man he never knew, held the key to his future? Or perhaps he would only find more questions, more emptiness to fill. Michael, for his part, was trapped in his own internal dilemma. Though he wouldn't admit it, Thomas's story had touched him more than he expected. The young man's tale, his search for a better future, made him think of his own son, Diego. Where was the purpose in his life after the tragedy that had scarred him so deeply? For years, he had driven that taxi as if it were his refuge, his salvation from a world he no longer understood. But now, listening to Thomas, something inside him was beginning to awaken. Dawn was beginning to peek shyly over the horizon. The road no longer seemed endless. The sky, though still grey, had a faint light that announced the end of the storm. The air held something fresh, renewing. Michael allowed himself a smile, even if only for a moment. There was something about Thomas that made him see the world differently, something that made him wonder if maybe this journey wasn't just for the young man, but for him too. He didn't know what they would find at the end, but something deep inside told him that, in the end, both of them would discover something that would change their lives. "You know," Michael said, breaking the silence, "sometimes things aren't what they seem. The answers aren't always where you expect them to be, but that doesn't mean there's nothing to learn along the way." Thomas looked at him in the rearview mirror, not entirely understanding, but with a faint feeling that Michael's words meant something deeper. "Do you think my grandfather was right?" Thomas asked, almost as if the question was also meant for him. Michael stayed silent for a moment, thinking. Finally, with a fleeting smile, he said, "I don't know. But if it helps at all, here we are, on this road. And for some reason, I feel like it's not a coincidence." The taxi kept moving, crossing the landscape that slowly changed with the passage of time. Although the destination remained uncertain, at that moment, both of them knew that something was happening. Something that had started before the taxi's engine roared to life that night in the rain. And no matter what the future held, they knew they were crossing a threshold that would take them to something much bigger than either of them had imagined. The taxi moved on through the stillness of the early morning. The first glow of the sun was timidly illuminating the sky, but the shadows still covered the road, erasing the outlines of the fields and mountains that were beginning to emerge on the horizon. The rough engine of the taxi and the whisper of the wind against the windows were the only sounds filling the air, creating a dense atmosphere, as if the world around them were on pause, waiting for something that had not yet happened. Thomas and Michael continued their journey, but the tension between them, though faint, was still present. The silence now felt different, no longer uncomfortable or heavy. It was a shared silence, one that had formed over the hours as words slipped between them without being necessary. Somehow their thoughts seemed to be connected, even though neither of them fully understood how. Thomas looked out the window, contemplating the landscape that changed slowly. The village they were heading to was still just a distant image, something that only existed in the promise of his grandfather's letter. He didn't know what he would find there. Maybe what he had been told was just a dream, a fantasy built on empty words. But it didn't matter. Hope still lived in him, like a small flame that refused to extinguish, even though he wasn't sure what that future he longed for truly meant. Michael, on the other hand, felt that time began to dissolve as he drove. The road, which once seemed endless, now seemed simply a bridge between the past and the future. His mind constantly returned to his memories of Diego, the nights they shared silences in the taxi, the conversations about their dreams, and the trips they never took. He felt that Thomas, with his story of search and hope, was a reflection of what his son had been. A young man searching for something others couldn't see, something only he could find on his own. The connection between them wasn't built with words, but with the simple act of sharing space, time, and thoughts, even silently. The atmosphere in the car was filled with a calm that was deeper than any conversation. Without saying anything, both of them knew that something was changing between them, that the journey was not only toward a distant village, but toward a deeper place in their hearts. Michael couldn't help but think about his own pain. He knew that he had decided to help Thomas not only out of compassion, but also because something in the young man had made him remember what he had lost with the death of his son. The feeling of guilt for not being able to protect Diego never went away, and the idea of being able to help someone in some way offered him a small possibility of redemption. Perhaps this journey, though unexpected, was giving him a chance to face his own emptiness. Meanwhile, Thomas felt the weight of his history and family in the letter he carried. Michael's presence on this journey gave him a strange sense of security, something he hadn't experienced before. He knew he couldn't stay still, couldn't keep searching for answers in the shadows of his past. But at the same time, he felt that the man beside him, that solitary taxi driver, understood something about him that he himself couldn't fully grasp. Sometimes, just not being alone seemed enough. Michael's presence was a constant, a silent presence that offered support, even without words. The road stretched out before them, seemingly endless. The landscape began to grow more rural, with green fields and scattered trees. The mountains rose on the horizon like silent guardians of what was to come. Thomas, silently, wished he knew more about Michael. He wanted to know why he had decided to keep driving, why he hadn't left his life behind like Thomas had. But he knew it wasn't the right moment to ask, that he shouldn't force a conversation that wasn't ready to be said yet. It was then, after hours of travel, that Michael broke the silence with an unexpected question. "What was it like growing up in foster homes?" he asked, his voice deep and calm, but with a hint of genuine curiosity. Thomas stayed silent for a moment. The question surprised him, but at the same time it felt strangely right, as if somehow Michael had touched a chord that had been dormant for a long time. He took a deep breath, and with a softer voice, he began to speak. "It was never easy," he began, looking ahead. "I was always moved from house to house. Some were better than others, but I never really felt part of any family. It was like being in transit all the time. I always felt like a stranger." Michael listened in silence, his hands on the wheel, but his mind focused on Thomas's words. It wasn't just the story of a young man who had been rejected. It was the story of someone who had been blown by the wind without a place to call home. "And your mother?" Michael asked softly. "You were never with her?" Thomas fell silent, his eyes fixed on the landscape. The question touched him in a deep place, one he had never dared to reach. He knew Michael wasn't judging him, but the answer still felt like an open wound, a subject he had avoided all his life. "I never knew her," Thomas said with a slight sadness in his voice, as if the absence of his mother had become part of his identity. "When I was born, she couldn't keep me. She was too young, and I never knew why she left me. The letter I have is the only thing I have left of her, of my family. But I also feel like I'm no longer a part of them." Michael nodded slowly, understanding more than Thomas could see. The silences between them were starting to speak more than words ever could. Thomas's story was his own, but there was something in it that connected him to Michael more deeply than he could explain. They both knew what loneliness was, but neither of them could say how to escape it. The taxi kept moving, but now there was something different in the air. Thomas and Michael shared a quiet stillness, a silent understanding. Although their pasts were different, something in them understood one another, something that didn't need to be said to be understood. Somewhere, beyond words, a connection was starting to form in this shared journey. The village was near. The destination was coming into view, and with it, an uncertain future full of possibilities. Thomas looked out the window one last time. He knew that this journey wasn't just about finding a legacy, but about finding the part of himself that had been lost for so long. The rain had returned with strength, hitting the taxi's metal roof like a constant melody, accompanied by the whisper of the wind. The vehicle's headlights cut through the darkness, but the landscape around them seemed to dissolve in the fog that covered the road. The temperature had suddenly dropped, and the fresh air felt dense, almost palpable. Though only a few kilometers remained to reach the village, Thomas and Michael no longer seemed as focused on the final destination. The journey had transformed something else in them, an inner path, not just a physical one, that was taking them somewhere deeper. Michael drove cautiously, the taxi's lights briefly illuminating the silhouettes of trees and fields that faded into the fog. Thomas was silent in the back seat, looking out the window with squinted eyes. He seemed trapped in his thoughts, lost in a labyrinth of doubts and expectations. The promise in his grandfather's letter was still his hope, but at the same time, he felt a weight in his chest, as if there was something beyond the letter that he didn't yet understand. The road was becoming emptier, and the constant sound of the rain on the roof began to grow louder, as if the world was soaking in water. Michael, despite the calm outside, felt an internal tension he couldn't fully identify. Something in the atmosphere had shifted, as if the very climate were pressing on him, as if something was about to happen. The calm before the storm, he thought. Suddenly, a sound interrupted the murmur of the rain, a sharp thud, followed by a metallic screech. Michael braked immediately, his instincts as a driver making him react quickly. The taxi swerved slightly, and a cloud of dust rose from the wet asphalt. The rain had made it almost impossible to see, but Michael stopped, his heart racing. "What was that?" Thomas asked, his voice tense, looking around through the rearview mirror. Michael stayed silent for a second. There was something strange in the air. Without thinking, he rolled down the window a few inches and stuck his head out, checking if there was any danger on the road. At first, he saw nothing, just the thick fog covering the asphalt. But something caught his attention. In the distance, he saw what appeared to be a car stopped. Michael cursed under his breath, and although his instinct told him it was better to move on, a strange feeling made him stop. He decided to approach the vehicle. "I'm going to check what happened," he said, not looking at Thomas, but with a firm tone. Thomas nodded silently, though he couldn't help feeling a growing worry. Something was wrong, but he didn't know what it was. With a quick motion, Michael turned off the engine and got out of the taxi. Thomas watched from inside as Michael approached the crashed car. The sound of the rain was deafening, but for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. The car was overturned, smoke coming from the engine, and broken glass scattered on the ground. There were two figures inside, a woman and a child, who seemed dazed but, luckily, not severely injured. Michael moved quickly, his experience as a driver in dangerous situations clearly showing. There was no time to waste. "Hey!" Michael shouted as he crouched beside the vehicle, carefully opening the driver's side door. "Are you okay?" The woman, visibly scared, nodded, but she couldn't stop shaking. The little girl, drenched in tears, clung to her mother, frightened. "We're okay, but we don't know what to do," the woman said, her voice cracking. Michael calmly signaled them to stay inside while he secured the area. The car was still smoking, and there wasn't much time before the situation could become more dangerous. Meanwhile, Thomas watched from the taxi, caught in a mix of helplessness and surprise. He didn't know if he should stay in the car or help. Something inside him told him he had to do something, but the image of the woman and the child, so fragile, left him speechless. Michael returned to the taxi with a cell phone in hand, calling emergency services. As they waited for the police and rescue services to arrive, the woman slowly stepped out of the car, trying to calm her daughter, who was now sobbing louder. "Thank you. Thank you so much," the woman said, her words broken by sobs. "We didn't know what to do. We were lost. We don't know how this happened." Michael, with his expression unchanged, just nodded. The situation, though seemingly under control, reminded him of how fragile people's lives were. It wasn't the first time he'd helped someone in an emergency, but every time he saw human vulnerability, something inside him stirred. The death of Diego, the tragedy of his own son, had marked him in a way that made him view life from a different angle. Meanwhile, Thomas observed everything from the taxi. He didn't understand why Michael had stopped, but seeing the reaction of the woman and the child, a wave of empathy grew inside him. It wasn't just about helping. It was the understanding that people, no matter how distant they seemed, always connected in moments of crisis. Strangers could be closer than one thought. This simple truth made him feel a little lighter, as if, for a moment, something in the world made sense. When the police arrived at the scene of the accident, Michael and Thomas made sure everything was under control. The woman and the child were quickly attended to and taken to the hospital for a checkup. The two men stayed behind, watching as the situation was resolved. The rain was beginning to subside, and the air felt fresher, as if the world were taking a breath. The calm after the storm, Michael thought. With his heart still racing, Michael returned to the taxi. Thomas looked at him through the rearview mirror as he climbed back into the vehicle, noticing that something had changed in him. He didn't know exactly what, but Michael was different. There was something deeper in his gaze. "All good," Michael said, with little emotion in his voice, but a slight sigh of relief. Thomas nodded, not knowing how to express what he was feeling. The silence in the taxi, which had previously been filled with doubts and unspoken questions, now seemed heavier, as if both were processing the same truth without the need for words. The journey continued, but there was something new in the air. A tacit understanding, something that transcended words and could only be shared by two people who had lived more than they were willing to say. And as the road kept stretching toward the village, Michael felt a deeper connection with Thomas. There was something in him that reminded him of his son, of that youth lost in an instant. Maybe this encounter, this unexpected night, hadn't just given him a chance to help someone else. Maybe it was also offering him a way to heal his own wounds. The rain had stopped, but the atmosphere was still damp and heavy. The road, though quieter, seemed endless. The light of dawn filtered diffusely through the clouds, giving everything a grey and somber hue, as if the world were waiting for something, but didn't know what. Michael's taxi moved slowly, its tires cutting through the wet asphalt as the vehicle's lights reflected the shadows stretching along the road. Thomas, who had been thoughtful at first, now looked out the window more calmly. There was something in the air that kept him uneasy, a sense of anticipation that mixed with weariness. As they moved forward, the village they were heading to still remained on the horizon, like a distant promise. But the road seemed determined to stretch on, as if offering the two men more time to process what had already begun to happen between them. A strange connection that, though still hard to understand, grew with every mile. Michael hadn't said much since the accident they had witnessed. In a way, the work had been something that imposed itself on his routine. He had helped the woman and her daughter, but something deeper had touched him, something inside him that made him feel uneasy, as if the emotions he had avoided for so long were beginning to surface. There was an invisible weight on his chest, a constant reminder of everything he had lost. And now, with Thomas's presence by his side, that weight became heavier, more palpable. The tension in the air was broken when Michael saw the lights of a motel in the distance, the sign flickering intermittently. It was a modest place, but it seemed to be the only option on that stretch of deserted road. Without thinking too much, Michael slowed down and turned into the parking lot, stopping in front of a dilapidated entrance, barely illuminated by the light of dawn. "Want to rest?" Michael asked, his voice rough, but with a tone that suggested he wasn't looking for company for a long conversation. Thomas nodded without saying a word, though it was clear they both needed to stop. Weariness had caught up with them, and the journey, though not yet over, had already left a deep mark on them. Michael turned off the engine and got out of the car, feeling the cold air on his face. Thomas followed, both walking in silence toward the small motel reception. The inside of the motel smelled of age, with worn furniture and the creak of wooden floorboards beneath their feet. The receptionist, an older man with a tired expression, handed them a key without saying a word. The room was basic, 2 single beds, a table with a flickering lamp, and a bathroom that seemed to have been renovated sometime in the past decade. However, at that time of the morning, it was all they could ask for. Thomas placed his backpack on the nearest bed and walked over to the window, looking out at the desolate landscape outside. The motel seemed to be on the fringes of life, far removed from any other place. There were barely any road signs or people around, making him feel even more isolated. Michael, for his part, headed toward the small bathroom to freshen up a bit. When he came out, he stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Thomas, who was looking out the window. Although the atmosphere was silent, there was a palpable tension in the air, an uncomfortable feeling that they both shared but didn't know how to resolve. "It's strange, isn't it?" Michael remarked, breaking the silence, though his voice sounded distant. "This whole trip, everything we've been through. Sometimes I wonder if things happen by chance, or if there's really something behind all this." Thomas looked at him from the window, still gazing out at the landscape. The question made him think, but he didn't want to delve into it. He wasn't ready to think about what all of this really meant, what the trip truly represented for him. He had come this far searching for something, but still didn't understand what it was. "I don't know," Thomas finally responded, his tone calm, but with a slight uncertainty in his voice. "I just know that I'm here, and that I have to keep going." Michael nodded slowly, as if Thomas's words made him reflect on his own life. There was something in the young man's determination that made him feel that maybe he too should move forward, leave the past behind, and do something with the present. The conversation fell silent again, but this time there was no discomfort. Both knew they were in different places in their lives, but somehow this journey had brought them together. Perhaps it wasn't the destination that mattered, but the path they were walking together. Neither of them fully understood why, but they both felt there was something meaningful in all of this. When night fell, Michael and Thomas decided to have dinner in the motel's small dining area. The place was nearly empty, with only a couple of travelers sitting at lonely tables. The dishes were simple, but the food, though basic, had a comforting taste that became even more flavorful due to the accumulated tiredness. As they ate in silence, Michael began telling stories from his years as a taxi driver. He smiled half-heartedly as he recounted some of the strangest situations he had lived through behind the wheel. Eccentric passengers, unexpected conversations, accidents that had left him breathless. Thomas listened attentively, occasionally laughing softly, but not interrupting too much. It was the first time in a long time that someone seemed interested in hearing his stories, and for a moment it gave him a warmth he hadn't felt in years. The conversation shifted from taxis to more personal topics, but without going too deep. Thomas, like Michael, remained reserved. He wasn't ready to open up completely. However, the small talks seemed to be enough to break the ice, to build a foundation of trust that, though subtle, was beginning to form between them. After dinner, they both returned to their motel room. Thomas climbed into bed, staring at the ceiling as the rain began to fall again. The sound of water hitting the roof seemed to set the rhythm of his thoughts. Though he didn't know what tomorrow would bring, something inside him told him that this journey had already changed him, even if just a little. Michael, for his part, sat in the chair by the table, looking outside through the fogged-up window. The landscape seemed so distant, so disconnected from the noise of the world. Yet for once, he felt that stillness wasn't an enemy, but an opportunity to reflect, to rest, even if just for one night. The next day would be the end of this part of the journey, and although there was still much to be done, both Thomas and Michael knew that, somehow, this encounter had begun to unveil something deeper within them. The sun had started to rise on the horizon, bathing the landscape in a golden light that filtered through the scattered clouds. The cool morning air came through the motel window, renewing the atmosphere. Thomas woke up before Michael, as if the rest had given him new energy. Although the journey had been long and exhausting, an inexplicable impulse kept him alert, as if he were about to discover something he had been waiting for years. Thomas got out of bed quietly, trying not to wake Michael. Opening his backpack, he took his grandfather's letter and looked at it for a moment, feeling that in those yellowed and crumpled papers was a story only he could decipher. It wasn't just a letter. It was the last trace of a life he never knew, but that somehow still stayed with him, guiding his steps. Although uncertainty still lingered in his mind, he felt that the answer was closer than he thought. Suddenly, something that had been forgotten at the bottom of his backpack caught his attention. It was a small metal amulet, worn by time, with an abstract design that he couldn't fully recognize. Thomas held it between his fingers, observing the intricate patterns that adorned the piece. Though he didn't remember ever seeing it before, something about it made him feel a strange connection, as if it were part of his story, part of his family. The amulet had a symbolic weight that seemed to carry more meaning than Thomas could understand at that moment. Without knowing how, he brought it close to his chest and held it there for a moment, as if waiting for the object to reveal something to him. Michael, who had woken up from the sound of the light breeze entering through the window, watched Thomas from his bed. Despite the initial discomfort he felt seeing the young man holding the amulet, he said nothing. Instead, his gaze softened, as if, somehow, he sensed what was happening. "Is that the amulet?" Michael asked, his voice rough, but with curiosity slipping through his words. Thomas looked at him, surprised. He hadn't realized that Michael had been watching him so closely. He nodded slowly. "Yes, I found it in the backpack. But I don't know where it's from. I don't remember." Thomas shrugged, as if the amulet were just another object, but unable to avoid the strange feeling it brought him as he held it. "Something tells me it has something to do with my grandfather. Maybe it's what he left for me." Michael sat up on the bed, still a little sleepy, but with an expression that Thomas couldn't read right away. There was a pause in which both looked at the amulet in the young man's hands. The air seemed to charge with an electricity neither of them understood. Michael finally broke the silence, his voice softer than usual. "That is strange. He paused, as if trying to order his thoughts. "I also had a similar amulet." Thomas looked at him, surprised by the confession. Michael seemed to be struggling to find the words, as if the idea of talking about his past was harder than he expected. "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, with more interest than he had shown in the whole conversation. Michael sighed and rubbed his face as if wanting to release a part of himself that had been kept hidden for so long. After a long moment, he began to speak. "Many years ago, when I was still young, I picked up a man in my taxi. He was running from something. I don't know what. He didn't tell me anything. But he was an older man, and at the end of our ride, he gave me this amulet. He said it was a protection talisman, something I should always carry with me. I didn't understand why he gave it to me, or what it meant, but I kept it. Sometimes when things went wrong, I'd touch it, and I'd feel, I don't know, calmer." Thomas listened attentively, absorbing the revelation. Michael's story, though vague, seemed to resonate with something deep inside him. The metal piece, which had been in his backpack all through the journey, now took on a completely new meaning. Fate had made him find the amulet, but now it seemed that Michael also had a connection to it, in a way neither of them could yet understand. "That can't be a coincidence," Thomas murmured, almost to himself. "Do you think my grandfather left me this amulet, that he knew about it?" Michael stayed silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the amulet that Thomas still held in his hands. Then he finally spoke, with a tone that mixed uncertainty with a strange sense of revelation. "I don't know, but if my experience means anything, maybe this amulet. Maybe it's trying to tell you something. Maybe it has more to do with your grandfather than you realize." The air in the room felt thicker, as if the simple act of sharing the amulet opened a door to a shared fate between them. As Thomas held it in his hands, he felt a strange connection, not only with his grandfather, but with Michael, with his story, and with everything he was about to discover. "I'll keep it with me," Thomas said finally, as if making an important decision. "I don't know what it means, but I think it has something to do with what I'm looking for, with what we need to find." Michael watched him, noticing something in Thomas's determination that made him think about his own journey. Though he was still marked by the pain of his loss, something in that moment made him see that maybe his path wasn't completely closed. Maybe, in some way, this young man, with his amulet and his hope, was helping him discover what he himself had lost. Thomas put the amulet in his pocket as a symbol of the connection he had just made with his grandfather, and perhaps with Michael himself. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt that something inside him had begun to change. Something within him felt lighter, as if the pieces of his life, though still scattered, were slowly beginning to fit together. Michael, for his part, looked at the young man with a faint smile, a smile that spoke more of understanding than anything else. He didn't know what awaited them when they reached the village, but something in that journey was giving them the chance to heal. And though their paths were still full of uncertainty, they both knew that this amulet, this small object, was no longer just a memory from the past. It was a sign, a guide to what was to come. Though the atmosphere was calm, something in the air still felt heavy, as if the world was about to change direction at any moment. Thomas, sitting in the back seat, stared at the blurry landscape through the window, lost in thought. The amulet he had tucked in his pocket now seemed heavier than before, as if it was reminding him that the journey he was on wasn't just toward a physical destination, but toward something deeper within him. Michael, for his part, couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. He had spent too many years driving these roads, but he had never felt a journey so uncertain, so laden with something inexplicable. It wasn't just the destination that awaited them, but what the journey itself was beginning to reveal in both of them. As the taxi moved forward, Michael couldn't stop thinking about what he had shared with Thomas the previous night. The amulet, the stories, the connections. Something inside him told him that this encounter between them wasn't a coincidence. Somehow, they were both connected by something much greater than they could comprehend. The taxi started again. Although the day was already in full swing, Thomas knew that none of what had happened was just a coincidence. That woman and her daughter, the accident, the way Michael had reacted, it was all intertwined with something much bigger. Michael, with his hands on the wheel, finally broke the silence, looking ahead. Sometimes life puts you in situations where you can only help. You don't know why, but you do what you have to do, even if you don't understand it. He paused, then added, "You know, maybe you're here to do something, even if you don't know what it is yet." Thomas looked at him through the rearview mirror, seeing a gaze that seemed much deeper than that of just a simple taxi driver. Something had changed between them, something they both were beginning to understand, even if only in their intuition. "Maybe," Thomas said with a small smile. "Maybe we're all here for a reason." Michael nodded without saying more. The journey continued, but now, more than ever, they felt that something inside them had transformed. The road, once just a path, now felt like an open door, an opportunity for something bigger than themselves. The taxi moved slowly down a narrow road, surrounded by green fields and scattered trees that seemed to whisper in the stillness of the dawn. As the sun began to rise on the horizon, the golden light bathed the landscape, turning the morning mist into vapor that slowly disappeared. Thomas, sitting in the back seat, watched the changing landscape as the feeling of being close to his destination grew in his chest. The village he had seen in his mind so many times was ahead, though still only a collection of distant houses, barely visible through the morning haze. Michael, at the wheel, kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel, but his mind, like Thomas's, wasn't entirely focused on the journey. The road had been narrowing more and more, and the air in the vehicle felt heavy, as if everything was about to happen. Michael had left the city behind, but not just the physical place. He was also leaving behind a part of himself, something he had kept hidden for so long, something that this young man, this stranger, had started to uncover without meaning to. The village began to take shape as they moved forward. The first wooden and brick houses became visible, small and scattered among the hills, as if the village had grown slowly, without hurry. The atmosphere was different from that of the city. There was something peaceful in the air, as if time here moved at its own pace, without the constant rush of urban life. The streets were made of stone, old and covered in moss, and the buildings, though modest, were imbued with a history that seemed to want to tell something to the travelers who arrived. Michael slowed down as they entered the town square. A couple of elderly people were sitting on a bench near a fountain that dripped softly, and a child ran down the street with a ball, not worried about anything else. It was a peaceful town, almost isolated from the rest of the world, with the feeling of being disconnected from the problems that plagued modern life. The taxi stopped in front of a small office beside the square. The sign above the door read, "Lawyer's Office," but beyond the name, the building seemed to belong to a past era, a time when legal proceedings weren't so cold or impersonal. Michael turned off the engine, and Thomas, with his backpack slung over his shoulder, got out of the taxi. The fresh air greeted him with a gentle touch, and for a moment he felt as if he had arrived at a place where he might finally find some peace. The lawyer was waiting for him inside the office. He was an older man, with graying hair and a tired but kind gaze. When Thomas entered, the man stood up to greet him, extending a firm but warm hand. "You must be Thomas," the lawyer said with a slight smile, as if he already knew who he was. "I've been expecting you." Thomas shook his hand, though something deep within him told him that this meeting wouldn't be as simple as he had expected. The lawyer invited him to sit in a chair in front of an old wooden desk covered with yellowed papers. It wasn't a luxurious office, but it had an air of antiquity that made time seem to stop in it. "I have some things to give you," the lawyer said, as he began pulling a carved wooden box from one of the drawers of his desk. "Your grandfather, James, asked me to deliver these belongings to you. He did so before he passed away. He wanted to make sure you received them." Thomas looked at the box closely. It was small, made of dark wood, with intricate carvings that, though worn by time, showed the craftsmanship of whoever had made it. When the lawyer opened it, Thomas could see what it contained: an old pocket watch, a set of rusted keys, and a small sealed envelope with his name written in elegant, though shaky, handwriting. Thomas carefully lifted the envelope, his pulse quickening as he held it in his hands. The lawyer, seeing his unease, nodded gently. "That envelope is for you. But before you open it, I suggest you take a look at this." The lawyer pulled out a small journal with worn leather covers and placed it on the desk, pushing the object toward Thomas. "This journal belongs to your grandfather," the lawyer said. "He wrote about his life, the decisions he made, and also the things he wanted you to know. It's a personal testament." Thomas looked at him, perplexed. He hadn't expected everything to be so profound. He had thought he'd only be receiving something material, but the fact that his grandfather had left him something so personal puzzled him. However, he knew he had to open the envelope first. He did so slowly, as if afraid of what he might find inside. When he pulled out the letter, his hands trembled. As he read the first words, his heart skipped a beat. The paper was crumpled, aged by time, but the words were clear, though written in hurried handwriting. "Dear Thomas, this is my last attempt to speak to you. I've lived a life full of regrets, but I've also learned that it's never too late to redeem what has been lost. I've left something for you, not out of obligation, but because I know you need to find it. What I've left you is more than material. It's the opportunity to heal what remains broken. Carry it with honor, and never forget who you are and who you could become." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the words. He knew this wasn't just a legacy of objects, but a legacy of life, decisions, love, and regret. What his grandfather had left him wasn't just a reminder of a man he never knew, but an opportunity to rebuild his own destiny. "This is more than I imagined," Thomas said softly, his gaze fixed on the letter. The lawyer watched him in silence, knowing that this moment was crucial for the young man. Sometimes, legacies aren't just made up of material possessions, but of the lessons and opportunities left by people who, though distant, were always there. Thomas stood up from the chair, the journal and the letter in his hand. He knew this was the beginning of something much bigger than his search for a material inheritance. He was starting to discover something deeper, something that went beyond the answers he had been searching for all his life. "Thank you," he said firmly, looking at the lawyer, but feeling a connection with his grandfather stronger than ever. The lawyer smiled faintly, nodding. "This is just the beginning, Thomas. Now it's up to you to find what you've really been searching for." Thomas looked at the box, the journal, and the letter. and then walked toward the door. Although he didn't yet know what would come next, something inside him felt different. He knew that, in some way, he had begun to heal. As he exited the office, Michael was waiting outside. Thomas looked at him for a moment, and without saying a word, handed him his grandfather's letter. Michael looked at it, then looked at Thomas with a faint smile. "So, what are you going to do now?" Michael asked. Thomas looked at him and smiled, a smile that reflected more peace than doubt. "What my grandfather wanted me to do," he said, "to look for what really matters." The village, with its calm and stillness, no longer seemed so distant. Thomas was ready to face it, to discover what lay behind his grandfather's words. He knew that his life would never be the same, and for the first time, he was willing to accept what fate had in store for him. The day slowly drifted toward its end, with the sun beginning to hide behind the hills surrounding the village. Thomas and Michael walked down the cobblestone streets, their steps softly echoing against the worn stones. Though the afternoon had settled in, the air remained cool and light, as if time itself were taking a breath in this forgotten corner of the world. Thomas, still holding his grandfather's letter and journal, felt that something had changed inside him. The letter and his grandfather's words had touched him more than he had imagined. Now, he felt he was not just looking for a material legacy, but something much deeper, something that connected him with his family, with his roots. But at the same time, something in his chest felt restless, as if not everything had been said yet. Michael, walking beside him, observed Thomas with a mix of concern and understanding. There was something in the young man's gaze that puzzled him, as if, despite having found a clue, he still lacked something. Maybe, Michael thought, it was the same emptiness he had carried with him for years. He couldn't help but think that Thomas's journey was also a way to find answers, to find peace. "So, what are we going to do now?" Michael asked as they walked, breaking the silence that surrounded them. His voice was softer, as if he were inviting Thomas to speak more openly. Thomas looked at him briefly, before focusing again on the path ahead. It was a simple question, but the answers he found within himself were anything but. "I'm going to find my grandfather's library," he said, without hesitation. "I think that's what he wanted. This isn't just about what he left materially, but about what it represented. I want to see what he did with his life here." Michael nodded without saying anything more. There was a calm in Thomas's decision that surprised him, as if suddenly the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. He didn't know what they would find in the end, but something inside him told him that what was left to discover would completely change the way Thomas saw his future. And maybe, in some way, it would change his own as well. Guided by the journal and the few directions the lawyer had given them, the two men walked toward the outskirts of the village. The path became more rustic, with dirt roads surrounded by wild vegetation, tall trees, and scattered houses. In the distance, through the trees, a small stone building appeared, seemingly lost in time. "Do you think this is—" Thomas asked, looking at Michael, his tone full of uncertainty. Michael nodded. "Yes, I think it is." They approached with steady steps, and when they arrived, the building revealed itself to them. An old farmhouse with walls covered in ivy, and a small wooden door that seemed reluctant to open. Next to the house, a rusted metal plaque showed the name James Community Library. Thomas stopped for a moment, staring at the plaque with a mix of awe and reverence. The idea that his grandfather had left something so important, so tangible, in this small village seemed almost unreal. Michael, who had been watching Thomas, looked at him and then approached the door. He gently pushed it open and stepped inside, inviting Thomas to follow him. The interior of the library was a mix of antiquity and life. Worn wooden shelves lined the walls, filled with books that spoke of past eras, forgotten stories, and knowledge. The air was filled with the smell of aged paper and wood. There were tables scattered around the room, some covered in layers of dust, while others held small objects like notebooks and mementos, suggesting that the space was still in use. In one corner, a broken window allowed some light to enter, creating a melancholic yet welcoming atmosphere. Thomas walked around the place, his hands trembling as he touched the shelves. Every book he touched felt like a connection to his grandfather, to the life he had lived here. The library wasn't just a place of knowledge, it was a testament to everything James had built. In one corner, he found an old wooden table where a smaller journal rested, almost identical to the one he had received. He approached it, opened it gently, and began to read. The words were clear, but filled with the emotional weight of a man who had lived much, but regretted not having done more. Michael watched from a distance, knowing this moment was important for Thomas. He didn't dare interrupt him, but something inside him moved him to approach. "What does it say?" Michael asked softly, stepping closer to Thomas. Thomas looked up and met his gaze with a profound expression, as if he had just understood something crucial. He founded this library because, when he was young, he didn't have the opportunity to learn everything he wanted. He wanted to give future generations the chance to know more, to dream. Michael nodded, understanding the magnitude of what Thomas had just said. The library wasn't just a legacy of books, it was a reflection of his grandfather's values, giving others what he couldn't have. The letter, the amulet, the journal, all of it carried with it a lesson that Thomas was beginning to understand. Thomas continued flipping through his grandfather's journal, reading excerpts that revealed not only the man's life, but also his regret for not being a better father or grandfather. He had struggled with his past, with the decisions he had made, but through his work here, in this village forgotten by time, he had tried to do something good, something that would endure. "My grandfather," Thomas said, his voice breaking with emotion. "He tried to redeem everything he did wrong. Everything I've lost." Michael looked at him in silence, understanding the depth of what Thomas had just said. It wasn't just the books or the material legacy that mattered, but the opportunities one gives themselves to grow, to learn, and above all, to heal. "You know," Michael said, his voice soft but firm, "I think now you can do the same, Thomas. You can carry on his legacy." Thomas looked at him, feeling that Michael's words were a truth he had been searching for, even though he had never dared to say it aloud. This journey had not only been a search for a material inheritance, but a path toward his own growth. His grandfather's library, the legacy he had left him, was not just for the village, but for him as well. "Yeah," Thomas said with determination, looking at Michael, his gaze full of gratitude. "I think I'm ready to continue his work." In that moment, Thomas understood something profoundly important. This village, this library, were now a part of him, just as he had been a part of his grandfather's story. And though the future was still uncertain, he knew he had found a purpose much greater than any material inheritance. The fresh morning air wrapped around the small village as Thomas and Michael left the library. The sun was fully awake now, covering the landscape with warm, golden light. The first signs of life began to stir in the village, some people sweeping their porches, a couple of children running through the streets, and the sound of birds filling the silence. Everything seemed in its place, as if the village had been waiting for this moment, for this revelation that Thomas had just discovered. Thomas walked slowly, the journal of his grandfather in his hands, as if the weight of those pages connected him to something larger than himself. He had spent so much time searching for answers, so much time looking for a place to belong, that now, having finally found it, the calm enveloped him in an unexpected way. His grandfather's legacy was not just the library, the books, or even the amulet. It was the lesson he had left him, to learn to live, to forgive, to heal the wounds of the past. Michael watched him in silence, walking alongside him. Though he didn't show it, something inside him had changed as well. Seeing Thomas discover the purpose behind his grandfather's legacy had touched him deeply. For a long time, Michael had thought his life was already defined, that his pain was irreparable. But something in the young man had made him reconsider many of his beliefs. Maybe life wasn't just about what was lost, but about what could still be done, about the new opportunities one could create, even after the worst tragedies. "You know," Thomas suddenly said, breaking the silence, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "When I read the letter, I didn't know what to expect. I thought all of this was just things I had to do to close a chapter. But now I understand that this isn't just about what my grandfather left me. It's about what I can do with all of this." Michael looked at him, feeling a small pang of sadness mixed with a strange hope. "It's hard, isn't it?" Michael replied, his voice soft. "Understanding what really matters. So often we think there's only one way to do things, one way to live. But sometimes what we need is to change the way we see everything." Thomas nodded, understanding the truth behind Michael's words. Though his journey had begun as a search to discover his past, he had found something much more important: the future. A future that didn't only depend on what his grandfather had left him, but on what he himself chose to build. His grandfather's library, the space that had been forgotten for so long, was now a refuge, a place where he could find answers. As they walked toward the central square, Thomas felt something inside him had changed irreversibly. He was not only beginning to understand his grandfather, but also himself. The scars of the past no longer seemed as deep, and the questions he had been carrying throughout his life began to dissipate. "You know," Thomas said, as he looked at the square that opened up before them, "I think my grandfather was right. People can't heal until they face what they've lost. And that's what I want to do now. I want to help this place grow, help the people here find what I found. The chance to start over." Michael watched him closely. The determination in Thomas's voice made him think of everything he had lost, and also of everything still left to discover. He couldn't help but smile, a smile full of hope, though tinged with a hint of nostalgia. "I think your grandfather would be proud of you," Michael said, with warmth in his voice that he rarely showed. Thomas smiled, though his smile was calmer than usual. He didn't need quick answers or easy paths. What he needed was to be present, to live this moment, and to start building what his grandfather had begun. He knew he would face many difficulties, that the road wouldn't be easy. But for the first time, he felt capable of facing whatever came. Not just for him, but for his grandfather's legacy, for the generations to come. The two men walked together through the village streets at a leisurely pace, enjoying the silence that had settled between them. There was no need for too many words. The journey they had taken together, the experiences they had shared, had already united them in a way that words could not explain. When they reached the square, Thomas stopped in front of the library and looked at the building with a new perspective. It was no longer just an old, dusty building. Now it was a beacon of possibilities, a space filled with history and future. It wasn't just a place of books. It was a place where people could find what they needed to heal, learn, and grow. Michael stopped beside him, observing the same scene. Though the future was still uncertain, something in the air seemed to have changed. Something inside him felt lighter, as if by helping Thomas find his way, he was also finding his own. "What are we going to do now?" Michael asked, looking at Thomas. Thomas looked at him and smiled, this time with more certainty on his face. "Now, we're going to give people what my grandfather gave to me. A chance to start over." Michael nodded, and together, without saying another word, they walked toward the door of the library. In that moment, both knew that although the journey had been long, it had not come to an end. On the contrary, it had just begun. The dawn of the next day brought an unexpected calm. The fresh morning air filled the village square as Thomas and Michael stood in front of the library, looking at the building with a mix of determination and reverence. The sunlight illuminated the old stones, giving them a golden hue that seemed to highlight the history the place held. There was something magical about this space, something that made everything else fade away for a moment. Thomas felt that, just like the library, he himself was being transformed. What had started as a search for answers, as an attempt to find something tangible to hold on to, had now become a much deeper mission, to bring life to a legacy, to a purpose, and perhaps to a future that he still couldn't see clearly. But something inside him knew he had to take that first step. Michael, standing beside him, also looked at the building, but his thoughts were not entirely in the present. There was something about this place that made him think of his own life, of the decisions he had made, and the opportunity he now had to rebuild something he had lost long ago. Though he didn't tell Thomas, he too felt that this place could be a form of redemption. The library represented much more than just books. It represented the possibility of giving others what he could never give his son, Diego, a future full of opportunities. "Are you ready to take the first step?" Michael asked, his voice low but full of a calm that reflected a deeper understanding of what they were both facing. Thomas looked at him, taking a deep breath. There was no doubt in his eyes, even though he knew this first step wouldn't be easy. But he felt it was necessary, that it was the only way forward. "Yes," he replied firmly. "My grandfather did it. This place was his way of healing, of giving something to people that he never had for himself. Now it's my turn." Michael nodded, giving him a small push toward the library door. "Then let's go," he said with a subtle smile. "Don't do it alone. I'll be with you." Together, they walked toward the entrance. Thomas, holding the key the lawyer had given him, paused in front of the door. It was an old door, made of thick wood, with carved details that, though worn by time, still showed a simple beauty. Thomas inserted the key, turning it with a click that resonated in the quiet air. When the door opened, a thick air of history and dust waved goodbye from within, as if the library had been waiting for them, ready to be revitalized. Thomas entered first, followed by Michael, and as they crossed the threshold, they were greeted by the silence of shelves filled with old books. Every corner of the room seemed to tell a story, and as Thomas looked around, he felt a deep connection with his grandfather. Michael watched Thomas with a look of respect. He knew this was the moment when the young man would take control of his destiny, and although he didn't say it out loud, Michael felt that this place belonged to both of them. In some way, they had arrived here together, even though the paths that brought them were different. "It's bigger than I imagined," Michael commented, breaking the silence as he surveyed the place with his gaze. Thomas nodded, his eyes shining with a new light, as if he had discovered something within himself that had been hidden for years. "This has a purpose," he said, almost to himself, "and I think it's time for everyone here to discover it." With determination, Thomas began exploring the library. Every book he touched seemed to carry a story, a fragment of his grandfather's legacy. In every corner, on every shelf, he felt the presence of James, the man who, though absent, had left something valuable in this place, the opportunity to learn, to heal, to change. Meanwhile, Michael began to observe more closely. The library was in precarious condition, many shelves were covered in dust, and some of the books, though well cared for, bore the marks of time. But there was something in the way Thomas looked at everything that gave Michael a sense of hope. He knew that this place, with time, could become much more than just a library. It could be a community center, a refuge for knowledge, a place where people could find what they were missing. "So, where do we start?" Michael asked, looking at Thomas with a smile that showed his unconditional support. Thomas looked around, surveying the books, tables, and shelves filled with untold stories. He knew he couldn't do it all alone, and though the task seemed enormous, he understood that the first step was to start with something small, something concrete. "Let's clean and organize everything first. Then we can think about how to open it to the people." Thomas took a deep breath, making the decision with conviction. "This is going to be more than just a library. We're going to give people what my grandfather gave them, a place to dream, to learn, and to find answers." Michael smiled and walked over to Thomas. "Count on me then. You're not alone in this." Together, they began organizing the shelves and cleaning the accumulated dust. It wasn't just a physical job, but an emotional one. Every book, every page they cleaned seemed to connect Thomas with his grandfather, with the story he had left behind, but also with the one they would begin to write together. They didn't know how long it would take, nor what obstacles they would encounter on the way. But they knew this was the first step. The first step to building something meaningful, to bringing life to what his grandfather had dreamed, and perhaps to building their own future. The day passed slowly, with Thomas and Michael working together in the library, organizing shelves, cleaning tables, and placing books in their places. Every movement seemed to carry with it an emotional weight, a load of history and hope that wove through the air. When the sun began to set, Thomas stopped and looked around. Though there was still much to be done, there was something in the air that had changed. The library, which once seemed like a forgotten space, now felt alive, as if it were waiting for something important to happen. "We've taken the first step," Thomas said, looking at Michael with a satisfied smile. Michael, who also stopped to observe the work they had done, nodded. "And together, we're going to make it grow. What started with your grandfather, now it's something you're creating too." The silence of the library was deep, but full of promises. Thomas, with his gaze fixed on the future, knew that this was only the beginning of something much larger. He knew that the journey he had begun seeking answers had now transformed into something far more powerful, a commitment to his own future and to the people who would come to this place in search of something more. The wind had started to lift small gusts of dust that moved quickly through the village streets. The afternoon was quiet, and the sound of birds in the trees of the central square filled the air. In the distance, the sound of a blacksmith's hammer and the murmur of distant conversations indicated that life in the village continued its course, indifferent to the changes unfolding in the small library. Thomas and Michael stood in front of the library door, which had been restored enough to open its doors to the community. They had spent several days organizing the shelves, cleaning the hallways, and dusting off old books. The transformation was palpable. The library was no longer just a forgotten space. It had begun to take shape as a sort of sanctuary for knowledge and hope. Thomas looked at the wooden door, his hands fidgeting with nervousness. Though he knew opening the doors of the library meant taking a step towards something big, he felt a mix of excitement and doubt. He had done everything possible to restore the place, but the real challenge was beginning now, getting the people of this small village to see what he saw in that space and what his grandfather had wanted it to be. Michael, beside him, watched in silence. Though he wasn't a man of many words, he understood the weight Thomas carried on his shoulders. There was something about this place that would not only transform the young man, but the entire community. And although Michael didn't express it out loud, he felt that the journey they had both made up until that moment had changed his own destiny. "Ready?" Michael asked, finally breaking the silence, looking at Thomas with a smile that didn't try to hide the warmth in his tone. Thomas took a deep breath, feeling the cool evening air enter his lungs. With a determined look, he nodded. "Yes, let's do it." Michael didn't say anything more. They both walked toward the door, and Thomas opened it with a gesture that seemed like the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him, but for the whole village. The interior of the library was illuminated by the soft light entering through the broken windows, creating a contrast between the age of the place and the fresh evening air. The shelves were filled with books carefully organized, and the atmosphere seemed almost magical, as if every corner of the room was waiting for those who needed something more than just knowledge. Thomas stopped in the middle of the aisle, looking around with a mixture of pride and nervousness. He knew that everything he had done in these days was just the first step, but now the real task began. In the distance, soft footsteps could be heard approaching, and then a couple of figures entered the library. They were two elderly villagers, walking slowly, as if they didn't dare take a false step. "Is this it?" one of them asked, a silver-haired woman with an inquisitive look. Thomas smiled, his nervousness fading a little when he saw someone daring to enter. "Yes, this is it," he responded with a renewed calm. welcome." The two elderly people looked at each other, surprised to see the library restored. The woman, with a look of amazement, slowly walked over to one of the nearby shelves, her fingers brushing the spines of the books as if reliving an old memory. "I never thought this place would reopen," she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. Thomas watched her as his heart began to beat faster. He knew that this first visit wasn't just a simple act of restoring a physical space. It was a symbol of the connection between generations, a connection his grandfather had wanted to create. The books, the knowledge, the stories, everything that had been hidden in the darkness was now there, waiting to be rediscovered. "This place is for all of you," Thomas said, pointing to the shelves with a sincere smile. "There's not just books here. There are stories. There are dreams. It's a space to learn, and above all, to share." The woman looked at him with a nostalgic smile. "And what kind of books do we have here?" she asked, with curiosity that stirred something inside Thomas. "Everything," he replied, with a spark in his eyes. "History, literature, science, poetry. Everything my grandfather left. Everything he wanted to share with the people." The two elderly people began walking through the aisles, looking at the titles, their whispering voices filling the space with a mix of emotion and awe. Thomas watched them, and for a moment, he felt something ignite inside him. This was the purpose of everything he had done, everything he had learned, to share what his grandfather had left behind, to bring life to a space that, in some way, represented the possibility of redemption for everyone. A couple of hours later, more people began to enter. First, the elderly from the village, then some curious young people, and finally, families who had heard rumors about the library's opening. Although the place was still simple, people seemed to perceive what Thomas had intuited from the beginning. This wasn't just a place to read, it was a refuge, a space where people could go beyond the everyday, where they could find something that had been eluding them. Thomas, watching the library slowly fill up, realized this was only the beginning. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be difficulties, but something inside him told him that this place could be the start of something big. A place where dreams were not only possible, but accessible. Michael, watching Thomas among the crowd, slowly approached, smiling as he saw people exploring the library. There was something deeply human in everything that was happening, something that made him feel that maybe, after all, there was still time to change. "You did it," Michael said, his voice low but full of admiration. Thomas looked at him, his face illuminated by a smile that showed more than satisfaction. It showed hope. "Not yet," he said, looking around, seeing the conversations unfolding between the shelves, the laughter, the questions. "But we're on the right path." And, as the evening light continued to illuminate the library, Thomas knew that what had started as a search for his past had now transformed into something much bigger, a legacy for the future, for all those who would come in search of a place to learn, to heal, and perhaps to dream. The transformation had been gradual but profound. Since it opened its doors to the public, the library had begun to fill a void in the village that Thomas had never imagined. What started as a simple space for books had now become a place where people of all ages came to seek something: answers, knowledge, comfort, and even community. Thomas was sitting alone, watching the flow of people beginning to enter, some with shy smiles, others with looks of awe, as if they had finally found a place that accepted them. Each face was a reflection of his own personal journey, a reminder that every human being is searching for something bigger than surface-level answers. Thomas didn't know it yet, but somehow, the fact that people were there, actively participating, meant the space was already fulfilling its purpose. As Thomas lost himself in thought, he heard footsteps behind him. Michael, with his familiar and always observant face, appeared in the doorway, smiling slightly as he made his way toward the table. "Everything okay?" Michael asked, sitting across from him without expecting much more. Thomas looked up and nodded, but something in his face reflected a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "Yes, but I feel like there's something more to be done. It's not just about opening the doors. It's about giving purpose to these spaces, showing people what they can really find here." Michael, with a calm smile, observed him. "You know that takes time, right?" Michael said, as if speaking from experience. "The simple fact that you're here, doing this, is already the first step. You're giving something that many didn't even know they needed." Thomas sighed, placing the coffee cup on the table. It was true. He had done what his grandfather had dreamed, and something inside him felt that this place was already enough. Yet, his desire to connect with others, to show them how the library could change their lives, pushed him forward. "Maybe it's time to do something more," Thomas said, with determination in his voice. "Maybe what I need to do is organize more than just opening the doors. I want people to feel part of something. Maybe it's time to start offering workshops or activities, something that involves them more." Michael looked at him, observing his enthusiasm with the understanding of someone who had seen that spark in the eyes of a man starting to understand his purpose. Michael had witnessed Thomas's transformation from a lost young man searching for answers to a leader beginning to forge his own path. "That sounds like a good idea," Michael said, shrugging. "Maybe you should start with something small, a talk, a workshop, something that invites people to share what they have inside. This place is a refuge, but it can also be a meeting point for those who need a purpose." Thomas nodded, reflecting on Michael's words. Perhaps the time had come to take that step, to offer something beyond books, something that would connect people, give them a space to share and grow together. He hadn't just created a refuge for knowledge, but also a place for the community. That afternoon, Thomas sat down in front of a blank page, starting to write down some ideas about what he could do to involve more people. Why not a writing workshop for the youth in the village, or a series of talks about the history of the place so people could understand more about their past and present? The page quickly filled with ideas. There was something incredibly exciting about the possibility of seeing how this space could grow beyond what his grandfather had dreamed. The next step was to shape those ideas, but before doing so, Thomas needed to talk to the people who were already beginning to frequent the library. He decided to organize a small meeting, something informal, to hear what they thought, and above all, to invite them to be an active part of the change that was already taking place. That afternoon, the library filled with murmurs and soft laughter. People of all ages gathered at the tables, some with books open, others talking in small groups. The air was filled with a sense of curiosity and discovery, and Thomas watched as the walls of the library filled not only with books, but also with voices. He was no longer alone in his mission. Now, the village was beginning to be a part of it. Thomas climbed up to the small makeshift stage in one of the corners, and with a sigh, he looked at the people who had gathered. Most of them already knew each other, but there were a few new faces, people who had never visited the library before, but who now seemed drawn to it. "Thank you all for coming," Thomas began, his voice a little shaky but filled with emotion. "I want to share something with you. This library is not just mine, it's ours, and I'd like to know how we can use it better, not just to learn, but also to grow together, to share our stories and ideas." The people looked at him with interest. Thomas continued, "I'm thinking of organizing workshops and activities, but I want to know what you'd like to do here. What do you think we need? How can we make this place something we can all enjoy?" There was a general murmur of approval, and then, slowly, people began to speak, sharing their ideas. An elderly man suggested a cooking workshop to share traditional village recipes. A woman proposed organizing poetry readings to give a voice to local writers. A shy boy raised his hand and suggested having a play area where young people could learn and have fun at the same time. Ideas began to flow like a torrent, and Thomas felt overwhelmed but also grateful. The library was no longer just a place of passivity. It had become an active space, a center for creativity and exchange. When the meeting ended, Thomas approached Michael, who had been watching him in silence from a corner. "I didn't know this would happen so quickly," Thomas said, with a smile on his face. Michael looked at him, his gaze calm and wise. "People just need a place to be heard, and you, Thomas, gave them that place. Now it's their turn to make it their own." Thomas paused for a moment, feeling as though something big was beginning to take shape. This wasn't just his grandfather's library. It was something much bigger, something that belonged to everyone. The rain outside had decreased, and the sun was beginning to shine weakly through the clouds. Thomas, with his heart full of hope, looked around, seeing the people enjoying what he had started. He knew this was only the first step, but now something inside him told him that everything he had done had a much greater purpose. The day had dawned clear, and the village seemed more vibrant than ever. People moved through the streets with a renewed energy, as if the arrival of autumn had brought with it an invisible kind of hope. Thomas found himself in the square, in front of the library, watching as the preparations for the day's event took shape. A couple of tables with banners, a small stage set up in the corner of the square, and a crowd of people, from children to the elderly, began to gather with smiles on their faces. There was something special in the air, as if the community had finally found the space it had long needed. This afternoon wasn't just the official opening of the library, but also the rebirth of something much bigger, a legacy of his grandfather, which had now become an opportunity for everyone. Thomas was nervous, but not like before. Now, his heart beat with a mix of excitement and gratitude. He had taken the first step toward what his grandfather had dreamed, but this event marked the culmination of his effort, the moment when what had started as a personal dream extended to touch the whole community. Michael, who had been by his side the entire time, walked up to him as Thomas checked the final details of the preparations. "Everything okay?" Michael asked with a calm smile. Thomas looked at him, nodding. "Yes, everything's fine. I don't know if I'm ready for this. It's much bigger than I thought." Michael chuckled softly, giving him a light tap on the shoulder. "Sometimes what matters isn't whether we're ready or not. It's just taking the step, and you've done that. Look around you. The people are here because they believe in what you're doing, and that's what really matters." Thomas took a deep breath, feeling how Michael's words sank deep into his chest. This event wasn't just about his grandfather or the library. It was about the connections he had helped create, about the space he had opened for the community to thrive. The sound of music began to fill the air, announcing that the event was about to begin. Thomas looked toward the square, watching how people gathered, sitting around the tables and talking in small groups. Children ran between the chairs, while the adults grouped near the stage, where some of the younger members of the village were already preparing to perform a small play they had rehearsed at the library. There was a palpable sense of community, of belonging. The faces were familiar, but the atmosphere felt fresh, full of possibilities. Thomas and Michael made their way to the stage, where several local speakers were beginning to take the floor. The opening ceremony was simple, but full of meaning. Thomas looked around, seeing the people gathered, listening to the local speakers talk about the value of knowledge, unity, and community. Each word resonated in his soul as a reminder of everything he had accomplished, but also of everything still to be done. Finally, it was his turn. Thomas stepped up to the stage with a mix of nerves and gratitude. As he took the microphone, he paused for a moment, looking at the people who were watching him with expectations, but also with support. The library had been the start of all this, but this moment, this small step forward, was only the beginning of a greater change for the village. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice a little shaky at first, but with each word, his tone grew firmer. "This place, this library, is not just mine. It's ours. Each of you has been part of this process, and without you, this wouldn't have been possible. My grandfather, James, dreamed of a place where people could learn and find something more than just information. He wanted a refuge, a space to dream, and this is that place." Thomas paused, looking at the faces that were listening attentively. There was something about that moment that made him feel more connected to all of them, as if everything he had done finally had a clear purpose. "I know this is just the beginning," Thomas continued, with a smile that showed more confidence. "But what's most important is that this isn't just about the books or what's here. It's about what we can all build together. This space is for everyone. Here, we have the opportunity to learn, to share, and to build a future where each one of us can find their place." A warm ovation filled the air, and Thomas smiled, knowing that this moment, though just the beginning, meant something much bigger than him. It was the manifestation of a shared dream, a future being forged right before his eyes. The celebration continued with more activities, poetry readings, live music, and impromptu workshops that sprang up out of nowhere, with people volunteering to teach something new. The library, though still small, had transformed into a meeting place, a melting pot of ideas and possibilities. Michael approached Thomas as he watched the people participate in the activities. "You did it," he said with a wide smile, that calmness he had always had. Thomas looked around, seeing people sharing laughs, exchanging books, and learning from each other. He felt a deep satisfaction, but also a clearer understanding of what his grandfather had tried to do with this space. It wasn't just a place to store books. It was a refuge, a community hub, a point of connection for all the villagers. This is the first step, and hopefully, it will be the first of many. The evening began to fall slowly, and the soft lights from the library reflected on the smiling faces of the people. The rain had stopped, and the starry sky seemed to whisper a message of hope. Thomas, standing next to Michael, observed the scene while thinking about everything he had achieved. The library was not just a place, but a meeting point for all the dreams, doubts, and shared hopes. He knew that, although the road ahead would still be filled with challenges, this event had marked a point of no return. What had started as a small personal project had evolved into something much bigger, a community united by knowledge and the desire to grow together. And so, under the stars of that autumn night, Thomas understood that this was the legacy his grandfather had left for him. Not just a physical space, but a space full of life, learning, and the possibility of dreaming together. The evening had softly descended over the village. The warm lights from the library shone through the windows, and Thomas, like every day, found himself observing the place he had worked so hard to restore. The library was no longer just a space for books and knowledge. It had grown. It had become the soul of the village, a meeting place for everyone, a place where people could dream, share, and learn. People were coming regularly, and Thomas felt he had fulfilled the promise he had made to his grandfather. But while all of this was happening, something still lingered in his mind. A persistent feeling that had been there from the beginning, like an unsettled debt, something he couldn't forget. The person who had brought him here, who had helped him take that first step, hadn't received anything in return, and Thomas knew that, in some way, he had to repay him for what he had done for him. That person, of course, was Michael, the taxi driver who had picked him up on a rainy night, not knowing where he would take him or what he would do with his life. Michael had been there in the darkest moments, asking for nothing in return, simply offering his help. And that help hadn't just physically taken him to his destination, it had pushed him to take the steps that had brought him to this very moment. Thomas knew he had to do it. He had to thank him in some way. That night, after closing the library, Thomas decided to take the step. He walked over to the corner of the square where Michael usually parked his taxi, always hoping to find him. He wasn't sure what he would say, but he felt that this moment was necessary. When he saw Michael's taxi parked, his heart skipped a beat. He approached, and before he could open the door, he saw Michael stepping out of the vehicle, adjusting his jacket while looking up. "Hello, Thomas." Michael smiled with his calm and serene expression, as always. "Hello, Michael," Thomas replied, pausing for a moment before speaking, searching for the right words. "I've been thinking about what you did for me. When I got into your taxi that night, I was lost. not just without money but lost in my life. And you, without thinking, helped me, gave me a chance. And though I never said it at the time, I want you to know that changed everything." Michael looked at him calmly, but something in his expression showed a deep understanding of what Thomas was feeling. "I did it because you needed it," Michael said, his voice soft but firm. "There's no need to thank me. We all need help sometimes." Thomas smiled faintly, but his expression hardened slightly, as if something inside him had made up its mind. This time, he didn't just want to thank him. He wanted to do something bigger, something that could truly show his gratitude. "No, Michael, this isn't just a thank you," Thomas said more firmly, his voice laden with deep emotion. "I owe you more than words. I want you to know that the impact of your action was much bigger than you imagine. You didn't just give me a ride, you gave me direction. You gave me a future." Michael looked at him in silence, as if he didn't quite understand what Thomas meant, but the way he spoke made Michael feel that this gratitude was more than a simple courtesy gesture. "Michael, I want you to know that if it hadn't been for you, I wouldn't have made it to this point. And I don't want you to forget that." Thomas paused, realizing how important what he was about to say was. "I invite you to be part of this place, of this project, of my life. What you did for me, I want to return it, and I'm going to do it in the only way I know, by inviting you to take part in what we're building here." Michael raised an eyebrow, a little surprised, but without hesitation. "I don't know what to say. I never asked for anything in return. I just did what anyone should do." Thomas nodded, understanding the humility in his words, but also knowing that Michael deserved something more, something beyond just a favor. "I know you didn't ask for it, but I want you to be part of this, of the library," Thomas said, looking Michael directly in the eyes. "I want you to be part of this legacy, because without you, this place wouldn't exist." Michael stood in silence for a moment, contemplating what Thomas had said. Then, a soft smile appeared on his face, a smile that was not only of gratitude, but also of understanding. Thomas had understood what Michael had done and had found the perfect way to thank him. "All right," Michael said finally with a sincere smile. "If you really ask me, I'd be happy to be part of this. But what I like most about all this is seeing how you've changed, how you've managed to turn this place into something bigger than yourself." Thomas looked at him, feeling a deeper connection with him than ever, not only because he was thanking him, but because in that moment, Michael was also becoming a part of the story. He was no longer just a taxi driver who had helped a lost young man. Now he was a friend, someone who shared the same purpose. With a smile, Thomas extended his hand. "Thank you, Michael. Really," he said, and this time his words were full of emotion. Michael shook his hand firmly, with no need for more words. He knew this was a new beginning, one that connected them in a much deeper way. From that day, Michael began spending more time in the library. Not only did he help Thomas with the day-to-day tasks, but he also got involved in activities, talks, and workshops. The friendship between them grew, a strong bond fueled by mutual respect and the recognition of what they had built together. Michael was no longer just the taxi driver who had helped him in a time of need. Now, he was a close friend, someone who shared Thomas's vision for the community. The library, under his influence, became an even warmer and more welcoming space. And most importantly, Thomas had learned that sometimes the smallest actions can have the greatest impacts, and that gratitude isn't always measured in words, but in actions. The story of Thomas and Michael became a testament to how sometimes a single act of kindness can change the course of a life, and how in the end, what's most important is what we build together. In this story, we have witnessed a journey of transformation, not only physical, but also emotional and spiritual. Thomas began his journey seeking something tangible, a material inheritance, an answer that would pull him from the abyss of despair. However, what he found was much deeper than he imagined, a legacy of learning, hope, and above all, community. Since his first encounter with Michael, the taxi driver who offered him a helping hand without asking for anything in return, Thomas began to understand that the true riches are not in material things, but in the relationships we cultivate, in the human connections that help us heal and find a purpose. Michael, with his simple act of kindness, not only gave him a ride, but guided him toward a future that he had forgotten was possible. Throughout the story, Thomas learns that life isn't always about finding immediate answers, nor about solving all problems at once. Sometimes, real change begins with a small gesture, an action that pushes us to see the world from a different perspective. The library, although it was the cornerstone of this journey, represented something much larger, a symbol of the possibility of creating something beautiful, even when the path seems uncertain. The story reminds us that gratitude is not always expressed in words, but in actions. Thomas doesn't just thank Michael, but invites him to be a part of what he has built, recognizing that the true value of life lies in sharing what we have with others. And in this act, he not only honors Michael, but also his grandfather, who, with his vision, left the greatest legacy possible, a space where people can learn, heal, and above all, find each other. In the end, the real reward for Thomas wasn't just the library or the material inheritance, but the friendship, the mutual support, and the understanding that when we unite with a purpose, we can transform not only our lives, but also the lives of others. The story of Thomas and Michael is a reminder that sometimes what we need most isn't what we're looking for, but what we find along the way. Human kindness, connection, and love in its simplest yet most powerful forms. And that brings us to the end of our story today. We hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss anything. See you in the next video. Take care.